Welcome to Basics of the Faith, Session 23. With this session, we are beginning Section 3 of the Catechism of the Catholic Church, also known as Pillar 3. In this section, the Catechism deals with the moral life. How should we live? How we should live, what our moral rules are and should be, are based on previous two sections. The first one where we discussed what do we believe, and the second one, how do we celebrate, primarily the sacraments and other liturgical services. In this session and the next, we will discuss moral theology in general, the basics of the moral life. The following sessions will deal individually with each of the 10 Commandments. Now here we have what is unfortunately an extremely common attitude. I have heard this said, perhaps not in these exact words, but I have heard actual adult Catholics and others use this type of reasoning. Here, Dennis the Menace, praying very nicely before he goes to bed at night, is saying to God, I'm sure you wouldn't have put that mud puddle there if you didn't want me to splash Margaret. Poor Margaret. This type of reasoning is sometimes used by people that say God would not have let us learn how to do this or that, or would not have made it possible if he didn't want us to be able to do it. Just think that through for a minute. It's very obviously a false conclusion, a very faulty logic. Look around you. There are many things in the world that we are able to do that obviously God does not want us to do. God in His goodness, yes, His goodness has given us free will, and we are able to choose for ourselves precisely which actions we will choose. It is our responsibility to learn and to choose those that are actually God's will. So what is moral theology? It can be defined as a systematic reflection on the Christian moral life. It concerns helping us come to know through reason, enlightened always by faith, the truth that will enable us to make true moral judgments and good moral choices. It also discusses those factors that help or hinder us from leading a good and upright moral life. Those that help, obviously, are God's grace. We couldn't possibly do it without God's grace. The virtues, and on the other side of the coin, sin and vices that we must constantly be on guard against. I thought this was a very interesting quote from Fulton Sheen. Sorry about the little bit of a fuzzy picture here. But he is quoted as saying, moral principles do not depend on a majority vote. Wrong is wrong, even if everybody is wrong. Right is right, even if nobody is right. Think about it. Right and wrong come from God, come from our nature, come from what we are created to be. And whether or not the majority likes it, right is right and wrong is wrong. In Chapter 23 of the United States Catholic Catechism for Adults, the person who is featured in this chapter is the best person that ever was, Jesus Christ. Jesus in his function, in his life as a teacher when he was here on this world. This may not have been his primary reason for coming, but he certainly did do a lot of teaching. And what did he teach us? He taught us the way to the Father. He taught us how the Father is merciful and will forgive us if we ask Him to, and truly intend to reform ourselves. He teaches us how to live so that we can be happy. God made us to be happy. And he also deepened and perfected the traditional moral teachings of Israel. He did not get rid of any of the moral teachings of Israel, which were codified in the Ten Commandments that God gave to Moses. We still obey the Ten Commandments. But Jesus added to this more spiritual and interior and fuller dimension with the Beatitudes that he preached during his Sermon on the Mount, and also Sermon on the Plain, depending on which gospel you're reading. But really, there's only one commandment, or if you like, two, and they are quoted here in this box in blue. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the greatest and first commandment. The second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. If you really think about these things and really do what they say, you don't need to read all the other rules and laws and think about them and so on and so forth. If you really do these things, you will be keeping God's law and you will be happy. The first and most important thing to talk about when we begin to study the moral life is who are we? Who are we? As you can see in the quote from Pope Benedict XVI on the bottom of the page here, he says, what can we do will be false and pernicious while we refrain from asking, who are we? And this is quoted in a book he wrote called In the Beginning. It's a small book. It's a collection of a few homilies he gave on in the beginning of Genesis and its implications for our life. And in addition to speaking of creation and the meaning of the stories in Genesis, there's a lot of good moral principles that flow out of these truths. The important things, some of the important things, of course they're all important. Being made in the image of God implies relationality. Relationality. God is a relationship. He is a perfect relationship among the three divine persons. And the primary way in which we image God is when we exist also in relationships. No human person is made to exist in isolation. We are not made to be closed in on ourselves, to only be concerned with our own welfare and our own wants and our own needs. We are made to live in relationship and concern ourselves with the needs of other human beings. This capacity to exist in relationship also, very importantly, includes a relationship with God. In order to be in relationship with God, which is the very definition of heaven, we must open ourselves to the other. And human beings are capable of thinking and of praying, and this is how we develop our interior lives, and of course how we develop our ongoing and ever-growing relationship with God. As human persons, we could be called beings en route, beings always in transition, because we're not finished yet. We are not born perfect. That's the purpose of the life that we are currently living, to constantly better ourselves, to constantly seek for what we can do to become a better person, to increase our relationship with God through our relations and interactions with other people. All human persons, every one of us created, is called to be a member of the body of Christ, the brothers and sisters of Jesus and the children of the Father. This is our basic nature, our basic calling. And in order to achieve that, we need to know, how then shall we live? What then can we do? One of the primary characteristics of the human nature is freedom. we have free will and we have intelligence. And both of these are necessary to living the moral life. Freedom can be defined as a power to act or not to act, and so to perform deliberate actions on one's own responsibility. We are free to choose. The primary reason we are free to choose is that God wants us to love Him as He loves us. And love, of course, is a choice, an act of the will. And if we were not free, we would be incapable of loving. And loving in the best sense, is the most important thing that we are able to do. God created us rational, which means we do have the ability to think out and reason, to consider the evidence and to reach conclusions and so forth. We can initiate and control our actions. So this ability of our souls, that we have an intellect and free will is an outstanding manifestation of the divine image in us, because of course all of these abilities are found in God, of course, but to a much greater and complete and to us unimaginable extent. But they are a large part of what makes us His image truly. There's even a quote here under the picture from Sirach in the Old Testament that God willed that man should be left in the hand of his own counsel, so that he might of his own accord seek his Creator and freely attain his full and blessed perfection by cleaving to Him. That's why we're able to choose, so we can seek and ultimately choose God. To be free, it is necessary to do good and avoid evil. We know that God has set down, by our very nature, the way we are created, if we contemplate it, God has set down for us what ought to be done and what ought to be avoided. And by reason, we can recognize God's voice, urging Him to do just that. Sometimes it sounds contradictory, that the more you do what is good, the more you choose God's will over your own will, the freer you become. Sin is literally slavery. Think of addiction. You get addicted to the temporary pleasure it gives you, but therefore you do it over and over again, because any pleasure you get from sin or any kind of addiction is temporary. So you do it again to just try to get that good feeling again. And the feeling becomes less and less good as you go on. The choice to disobey and do evil is an abuse of your freedom, and it leads you to the slavery of sin. The only true freedom is to do what is good and just. And this isn't just some pious puritanical thinking. It's just the absolute truth. Freedom is what we just said. It is the ability to choose the good, although you can use it the other way. Exercising your freedom does not imply that you have a right to do or say anything you want, anything you feel like at the moment. That is not freedom. And a particularly important freedom that should apply to every human being is in religious and moral matters. You have to be free to make your own choices and your own commitments. No other man, no other government has the right to deprive you of this freedom. Once again, if you deviate from the moral law, you violate your own freedom, and you become more and more imprisoned within yourself. So you're not even really satisfied with yourself, but it also disrupts your relationships with everyone around you, and ultimately your relationship with the divine, with God. So how do we judge the moral quality of human choices and actions? Well, it is possible to morally evaluate a human act that is freely chosen in consequence of a judgment of conscience. An action that is done by a human being after this moral consideration and judgment can be called a good act or an evil act. The morality of any human action depends on, first of all, the object chosen. By object, we mean, what is it that you have chosen to do? The action that you decide upon. Some objects are inherently evil. They cannot ever be good. Some of them are very severely and seriously evil, such as murder, for example, or doing any kind of severe damage to a human person. That would be an evil action, and nothing can make the action itself good. There are three components to the morality of an act. First is, what did you do, as we just said. The next is the end. The end meaning, why did you do it? What are you trying to achieve by doing this action? Once again, the end can be good or evil as well, but you may not achieve a good end by an evil means. You may not kill somebody in order to save somebody else's life, for example, except in the, there are, exceptions to that. In self-defense, if somebody is trying to kill you, you're allowed to defend yourself. And if that ends in the death of the other person, once again, killing of the person is an evil act, but you didn't choose to kill the person, you chose to save yourself. But the end never justifies the means. You may not steal in order to achieve some end that may actually be good, and you certainly would perceive it as good, but you're still not allowed to steal. And the other thing that plays into the morality is the circumstance, the surrounding of the action. How are you being forced to do this action, in which case it would not be your choice to do it, so you would not be morally responsible, something like that. But all three things are taken into consideration when evaluating not the goodness or evil of the act itself, but the moral culpability of the agent or the person performing the action. And this can be very subjective, which is why you cannot judge another person's moral culpability. You can say the action done was a bad action, an evil action, but you cannot say that this person committed a mortal sin. That is between the person and God. As it says on the bottom, the responsibility for an action can be diminished or even nullified by several factors listed here: ignorance, duress, fear, habit, inordinate attachment, psychological and social factors. It could be something like an addiction. The person just couldn't help themselves. Doesn't mean it was good, and probably the first choice they made that got them into that situation may have been a morally culpable act. But once again, the culpability, the moral culpability, is between the person and God. So sin is always a personal act. It's always a choice that we make. You cannot sin accidentally. We are constantly choosing God's will or our will, and this is what we are free to do. Sin is an offense against God in disobedience to His love. And we are responsible. We have a moral culpability for a sin committed by another if we cooperate, if we have made it possible for them to do this wrong action, or possibly even encourage them to do the wrong action. We would be as guilty as they were. This type of reasoning is even recognized in civil law. If you were an accessory to a crime, you do have some responsibility and some guilt in a court of law for the commission of that crime, because it couldn't have occurred without your help. Since sin is personal, it has consequences for the human person. It offends against the love of God, which makes us less and less happy depending on the severity of the offense. It wounds our own nature. It makes us weaker. And it injures human solidarity. It isolates us from other people. It injures our human relationships.